Hey, yo, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. This is Smart TCG, and today I'm going to be going over my post-rotation tier list. I've been actively testing the post-rotation format, and I have a pretty good idea of where things are standing heading into upcoming tournaments. Rotation is going to be happening in just a couple of weeks, and the F block of cards are going to be rotating out. So the game is going to change quite a bit, so it's important to know where the top decks are standing right now. So with that being said, if you enjoyed the content, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. We're super close to 10,000 subscribers. I'll be doing another giveaway once we get there. So with that being said, let's hop right into it here. So hopping into it, we got a bunch of different decks. We're going to start off with some decks that have been getting a lot of talk recently. Most importantly, decks that have been performing really well in Japan. And we're going to start off with Feraligatr. Feraligatr is a deck that most recently won a Champions League with 5,000 players, so was able to take down a massive tournament. Now, this is going to be a deck that utilizes cards like the Melodic EX, also cards like Monkey Dory and Budu as well. Kind of a stally control type deck that can also attack with the Feraligatr, and I think the deck is really powerful. So we're going to put it up here in tier A. I don't think it's necessarily a tier S deck. I also don't think it's probably going to be at the top of tier A at the end of this, but I think it has a lot of potential, and I definitely respect the deck. I wasn't 100% sure necessarily how good this deck was, but then I started to play some games with it, and it actually made a lot of sense that it is performing well. So yeah, I think Feraligatr is a very strong deck right now. Next up here, we're going to go over, let's go over the deck that surprised a lot of people, and that is going to be that Ogerpon box deck. The deck that players like Tord Reklev used to get top 16 at the Champions League and has been seeing quite a bit of play. I think this deck is pretty strong. I definitely think this is one of the strongest decks in the format. I've been playing some games with it, and it just wins games just by making it so that your opponent can't even set up. It just, kind of destroys so many setup-based decks' board states before they really even get to play the game, because important cards like Manaphy have rotated out, meaning bench snipe attacks like that Wellspring Ogerpon are very dangerous. So yeah, I think this deck is really good. Definitely one of the best decks in the format. Very powerful. Next up here, we're going to go over the Ends Zoroark deck with the Darmanitan. I think this deck is decent. I don't think it's necessarily a top tier deck, but I think this deck is very formidable. This deck can struggle to some of the wall decks, which is kind of the issue. Also, doesn't necessarily have a great Ogerpon matchup as well, but I do think it's relatively consistent. Being able to use that Darmanitan at the beginning of the game is really good as well. Just kind of being able to kind of do something similar to what the Ogerpon deck does, just being able to snipe things, kind of blow up your opponent's side of the board before they get going is just, really good. So yeah, I think that Zoroark paired up with the Darmanitan is really powerful. Also have, access to things like the Reshiram as well with that Outrage, which is pretty good too. So, all right, next up here, we have, let's do Gardevoir. I think Gardevoir is one of the best decks in the format. I'm actually going to put it over the Gator. I think that Gardevoir is incredibly powerful. One of the more underrated decks right now. People aren't really necessarily talking about it as much as they should. I've done my testing with this deck, and I feel like it's really good into the current field. It does really good against the wall decks, also does really good against the turbo decks as well, which, turbo decks are still going to exist in this format. I do think you do pretty good against those. And yeah, the deck overall is still good. Even though it does lose the Kirlia, it still has access to things like the Zoroark, potentially also have access to things, like the Dunsparce. There are plenty of other draw engines that are actually really powerful. So yeah, I think Gardevoir is still very good. Definitely one of the best decks in the format if it gets going. The consistency obviously is not as good as it used to be, but still very powerful. Next up here, we got Gholdengo. Gholdengo has been seeing some success over there in Japan. I think it's pretty good. I think it definitely is one of the better decks. Doesn't necessarily lose a ton, just being able to use that coin bonus, really powerful draw engine paired up with that Make It Rain. Still has access to things like Superior Energy Retrieval, which is really important. You could even pair this card up with a Dragapult as well if you want to have a better matchup against some of those wall decks that do play cards like Cornerstone. Having access to that is really nice. So yeah, overall, this deck feels really good. Next up here, we have, let's go into Blissey. I think Blissey's good. I think Blissey's pretty powerful. It can struggle to decks that can kind of hit unlimited damage, but I do think the deck is pretty formidable. There's definitely, multiple different ways that you can play it. I do think right now with kind of how the format seems to be, I guess, slowing down, there are a lot of, setup-based decks in the format. Decks that also just don't necessarily do a whole lot of damage. You can kind of just like out-tank them. Which is, pretty important just because Blissey has so much HP, also paired up with things like Monkey Dory as well. Very powerful. I definitely respect the deck. I don't think it's necessarily a top tier deck, but it has felt pretty decent overall in testing. Next up here, we got some other decks. I mean, like decks like Mamoswine, Belly Bolt as well, Turbo Clefairy. I guess I'm not necessarily a huge fan of. I think that Mamoswine is actually a really cool card, but can be kind of difficult to get going. So yeah, we're gonna put those in C and D tier. But next up, have some other interesting decks. We have that Flareon box deck that has been seeing some success. I think it's okay. I don't necessarily think it's a top tier deck. It has been performing relatively decently in Japan, but I don't necessarily love some of its matchups against some of the top decks. I feel like it has some flaws overall. Can be a little bit inconsistent at times, but being able to set up an attacker really quickly is actually pretty good. So we're gonna put it actually in the bottom of tier B. I think it has some potential, but there definitely are some flaws to it. Next up here, we got the Turbo Hands deck. This deck has been seeing some success, not necessarily doing great, but it is a very simple and consistent deck. You don't really lose much of anything. You just kind of do the same thing over and over again. You use that Miraidon to power up the Iron Hands, and then you start attacking with it. It's okay, but there are a lot of decks that I think it can struggle against. For example, things like a Goldango if it gets going. I don't necessarily think also the Terrabox matchup is great. The deck can kind of struggle with, dealing with a Terrapagos if they're able to one-shot, one of these, Iron Hands. There's just a couple problems with it. Isn't necessarily the best overall deck, but it is consistent and it does the same thing pretty much over and over again. So there are some nice things about it. Next up, we have Hop Station. I think Hop Station is a bottom of B tier deck. I'm only putting it at the bottom right now because I think people haven't figured out how to build the deck really correctly. I think that it is a deck that is too powerful and has too many pieces. Just the Hop engine itself is very good. It's just knowing how to build the deck. And I think that there's so many different ways you can build it. Like, do you play like the Archaludons? Do you choose, just to go with the straight, like Zacian build, right? There's so many different builds I feel like that I've seen over at some of those Japanese tournaments that I think the deck is just not really entirely refined yet. So I think as that goes on, I think that the deck will start to see a little bit more success. I definitely expect it to show up at major tournaments like the Atlanta Regional Championships, which is coming up. So yeah, I think the deck is good. I think it's definitely, very formidable. Being able to attack, pretty much for free as well at the very beginning of the game with that first attack is really good. And also, really powerful cards like that Cramorant, great at taking out Phesantipides. It's, definitely pretty good. I think it's a decent deck. Can struggle in some situations, potentially to like a Gardevoir if they are able to kind of just throw one prizers that can one-shot you. Can definitely run into some issues there, but still a lot of potential moving forward. Next up here, we have let's go Raging Bolt. I think Raging Bolt is a tier 1 deck, potentially the best deck overall heading into the upcoming tournaments. It's great. It's consistent. It has actually some outplay potential now because you have access to to things like the Noctowl. You just have more versatility. I think that's like one of the biggest things that Raging Bolt struggled with in the past. It just was insanely linear, but now you actually have things, like the Noctowl engine gives you a little bit more flexibility. In some spots you have multiple different attackers, things like the Cornerstone, also you like Slithering as well. You could even play the Baby Raging Bolt too. That's something that's been seen some play. I think it's really good. I think, when you get going, definitely one of the strongest decks in the format. And yeah, I think at the very beginning of the format, decks that are just able to set up, I think are going to see success. I think that if your deck can actually set up, I think it's going to be, a pretty good choice. Because typically at the beginning of formats, there is the smallest amount of card pool that we will see for, the next year. Because like right now, rotation is about to happen. We have a pretty big card pool because rotation hasn't happened in about a year. So when the card pool shrinks, we lose consistency cards. So decks that are able to actually function and set up are going to see a lot more success because there's a lot of unrefined lists and decks just aren't necessarily super consistent right now. So something like Raging Bolt that, yes, does lose things like that Radiant Greninja, still I think are going to be pretty good in this format just because the deck was pretty consistent kind of to begin with, and there's a lot of consistency cards you can play in the deck. So yeah, I think this deck will still see plenty of play and also success. I think it's really good. All right. Next up here, we got Dragapult. I'm going to put it in tier B. I don't necessarily think this deck is great right now, but it's fundamentally incredibly powerful. It kind of has everything that you need, I feel like, to see success. However, its matchup spread is not great. Unfortunately, I haven't really been enjoying some of the matchups that it's had, specifically against things like the wall decks. Also, pretty much any deck that plays Clefairy, can kind of just like one-shot you out of nowhere. For example, like in Gardevoir, if they play something like Mew EX, they can Mew EX copy your Phantom Dive, and if you have Clefairy on the board, they're hitting for 400 damage, and they can knock out a Duskull. That's not very good. Also, losing things like the Rotom and also the Force Seal Stone and Lumineon really do matter, because Dragapult was already kind of a deck right now when it has access to things like Rotom, Lumineon, and Force Seal Stone. That was kind of struggling with, that consistency at times, right? It's obviously seen a lot of success, but its biggest drawback was you would just sometimes draw those hands where you just aren't able to function. And now when you take all those cards out, you kind of amplify that problem. So the deck was, kind of able to function right now just fine, but still ran into some consistency problems at the beginning of the game. But now it just gets even worse because of the fact that you don't have those important cards. So I think the deck is still pretty powerful. If you are actually able to get a Dragapult up, you still have things, like the Dusknoir, definitely a lot of outplay potential, comeback potential as well. So I definitely still think the deck will see success. But right now, until these wall decks get pushed out of the metagame, it might really struggle to start off. Next up here, we have Melodic with the Farigarath. This deck is pretty good. It's been seeing quite a bit of success over in Japan. Definitely think it's one of the better decks. The problem with this deck is it's incredibly prone to players just teching for it. If anyone techs for it, it's going to really start to fall off. Kind of similar to like Snorlax, for example, where Snorlax is a really good deck if no one really techs for it or like necessarily knows how to play against it. But when those things happen, the deck can really struggle. So I think having access, to the Melodic and also the Feraligatr gives you a lot of, win cons versus, some of the top tier decks. However, if players play tech cards, for example, Raging Bolt, choosing to put in their own cornerstone, these decks can really struggle. So yeah, overall, I think the deck is fundamentally good. Definitely takes a lot of decent matchups at the beginning of the format, but I do have some concerns that people are going to tech for it moving forward. That's why something like Feraligatr, which can actually, use the Feraligatr to do a lot of damage, might be a little bit of a better deck overall. Next up here, we have Ancient Box. It's not bad. It's okay. Can run into some consistency problems. Its matchups against, things like Raging Bolt, pretty decent. Losing things like Pokestop can feel kind of bad. Its Gardevoir matchup is okay as well. Your matchup against the Ogre Box is kind of scary, as they can just kind of try and board wipe you really quickly, but still think it's okay. I think it's a decent deck. I think its biggest problem is itself, not having access to things like Pokestop anymore is really unfortunate, because Pokestop will be rotating. Also things like Radiant Greninja as well. So the consistency problems are there, but if you do get it going, I think it definitely has some potential moving forward. Next up, we got Chen Pao. Chen Pao has a Budu issue. Has consistency problems. Losing things like Pokestop is really bad. It's okay. I don't necessarily expect it to see a whole lot of success at the very beginning. Maybe as more sets kind of come out, I get some more cards that I can actually use, but at the moment, I don't think it's great. Alrighty, next up here, we have Frostlass. Frostlass is a deck that I think it's actually not that bad, mostly paired up with Budu. I think that having access to the Budu plus like the Monkey Dory lock, you can definitely, kind of catch some people off guard with that. So I think this card is actually, pretty decent. Just like as an archetype in general, you are able to, trap a lot of people with the Budu, then get like multiple Monkey Dories on the board, get those dark energies to then fling the damage that your Frostlasses are putting on each other, like onto your board state, back at them, which, makes Budu significantly more powerful. You also have things like the Gravity Gemstone as well to kind of trap things in the active. It's not bad. I think it's a decent deck, but if you play against decks that play enough, switch cards are kind of able to deal with the Budu as well, you can kind of run into some problems. Next up here, we have Charizard. Charizard's still pretty powerful. I like the Terapagos variant of the deck just because it feels a little bit more consistent than the Pidgeot one. The Pidgeot one still feels very shaky. Having access to Terapagos and Noctowl, does provide another powerful attacker in Terapagos that you can easily power up, and also is a little bit more consistent in the early game, which is the thing that your deck, kind of struggles with right now, especially without access to things like that Rotom or Lumineon anymore. Being able to fan Rotom for your board state is really nice. So I do definitely like this variant a little bit more. You could even potentially play like a 1/1 Pidgeot line in the Terapagos build, because you can still fan Rotom for Pidgey, which is nice. So there's some other things you can do with it. Can struggle to some of these wall decks, though. The wall decks aren't great. Your Dragapult matchup is not great as well. But if Dragapult starts to see a little bit less play due to all these wall decks kind of pushing it out, you could potentially see some success with it. So yeah, I think it's pretty decent right now, but has definitely some glaring flaws. Next up here, we have the Slowking deck, the deck that's, trying to copy things like a Kyurem over and over again. It's just kind of a fun deck. It's not bad. You can definitely catch people off guard, but I don't think even, like, especially now without, like things like Manaphy, they can just knock out, all your Slowpokes, kind of before you get going. So it's a fun deck, but I don't necessarily think it's top tier by any means. But you can definitely steal some games for sure. Next up here, we got Archaludon. Archaludon is pretty solid. You know, it's just a consistent deck. It does what it needs to do pretty much every game. And kind of like I said just a few minutes ago, this is going to be a format where the decks that are able to set up the most are going to see success. And this is a deck that is very easy to set up. You just need one Archaludon and a couple Metal Energies in the discard pile, and bam, you got, what you need, right? So that's, pretty good. So I think that, Archaludon's still very, very powerful. Definitely going to see quite a bit of success, especially at the beginning of the format because it functions, and that's important. Next up, we got Miraidon. I think Miraidon's not bad. I mean, losing things like your V Pokemon, really, really kind of an issue. Things like Raikou, Forest Seal Stone, Rotom, Luminion, Raichu. You lose a lot of things, but I still think that Electric Generator is powerful. Being able to power up things like Iron Hands, being able to power up your Miraidon as well. I think the archetype is still going to exist. It's just people haven't figured out necessarily how to build it. I think this might be the time to potentially play things like 2/2 Magneton now. You probably don't need Area Zero anymore because cards like Raikou don't exist in the format anymore because they've rotated out. So yeah, I think that Miraidon is going to exist, but I just haven't necessarily seen a whole lot of lists or, kind of myself, putting a lot of time into this deck just yet. But I think that as time goes on, I think that, people are going to kind of figure out how to build it. Maybe we get a couple more powerful lightning type attackers in the next couple of sets that really, makes that Electric Generator, kind of special again, because there were so many different powerful lightning type attackers in the pre-rotation format that you can use. But now that's not the case. So yeah, I think that like Miraidon in the future, really, really good, but right now might be struggling, maybe even want to play Future Box instead. But I still think the deck has potential. Iron Hands, Ampy very much on the first turn is still really devastating. Last up here, we have Cerulege. Cerulege has been seeing some success. I mean, I personally think that Goldango's kind of just a little bit better because Coin Bonus is just such a great consistency card. Just being able to use, Coin Bonus on the Goldango over and over again. Not card, I mean ability. It's a great consistency ability. So that's, really, really nice to have. So yeah, just like overall, I think that the Coin Man is a little bit better right now than Cerulege, but Cerulege kind of does a lot of the similar things. It just deals a bunch of damage as a linear, 2-prize deck. Can be pretty hard to stop when it gets going. But, losing things actually like Radiant Greninja, pretty important. That card was really important in this deck. Also losing things like Palkia as well. Not having access to that star portal into that Radiant Greninja attack is really, really unfortunate as well, because you could take multiple KOs and also get energies in the discard pile, which is great, but you don't have that anymore. So at the moment, this is where I think the deck is going to land. It's an okay deck, but I think Goldango might be a little bit better. But anyways, this is going to be my tier list right now. Definitely a lot of things, are probably going to move over the next, couple of months once we have that Atlanta Regional Championships. So I believe there also is another Champions League that is coming up over in Japan in the next, few weeks as well. That will be happening. Maybe some things move, but this is where I think things are standing right now. So with that being said, if you enjoyed the content, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Let me know what you think of the tier list in the description. Also, shout out to Zapdos TCG as well for making the template. And make sure to go shoot them a follow. They make great content as well. But anyways, that's going to do it for me today. Thanks for all the support as always. This is Smart TCG, and I'll speak with you guys again soon. Peace out.